Today I'm going to show you a dish off my menu, and as I normally would, I'll show you how I make it, the technique and the method. But with this one, I also want to go a bit more behind the scenes and show you some of what goes into developing a new dish and getting it ready to serve, including how I make some of the creative decisions, working with an incredible ceramicist to have beautiful bespoke plates made for the dish, and then also how I think about the final presentation and how a new dish fits in with the rest of the tasting menu. The dish itself is a smoked fermented cashew nut pâté, which is much more striking and delicious than it maybe sounds. It's dressed with tarragon oil and cucumber and just finished with a couple of drops of this very intense low temperature concentrated blood orange. The core of the idea for this and the flavour combinations came about quite naturally because I was already making a version of this cashew nut pâté and I'd used it in a couple of different ways before on the menu. And then because I had this cashew nut pâté on hand, it was sort of becoming my go-to snack to have after service with leftover bread from the evening. And I think it's always a really good sign of a great place to start if you have something that's really moreish and delicious, even when it's in its least refined form. So before we get more into the dish, I'm going to show you this pâté method, and then I'll talk more about the other elements and some of the other creative decisions. All the details and the recipe for this will be down in the description, but basically to make the pâté, I soak cashew nuts overnight, first of all to soften them. Then they get blended with fresh water and a probiotic culture to make a puree. This probiotic culture that I'm adding is going to let me do essentially a sort of forced fermentation, where instead of something like sauerkraut where you're relying on naturally occurring bacteria multiplying, here we're dosing in the lactic acid bacteria that we want to make the fermentation occur really rapidly. I do this accelerated fermentation in vacuum bags where it just sits for 2 days at room temperature and then it's ready to work with. That fermentation really starts to transform the flavour of the cashew pâté, adding this savouriness and acidity. And then to add more depth and complexity to the pâté, I'm going to smoke it with oak. For this, I just use a little handheld smoking gun, and I run the pâté on a low speed in the blender whilst directing smoke into it. That means it's not just the top surface of the pâté that's coming into contact with the smoke, so it's a nice way of introducing that flavour. I'll let that smoke and churn for a few minutes and then I'm ready to season the pâté. It gets finished with some salt and lemon juice. And then the final element, just to further complement those fermented flavours and add a touch more complexity, is some minced homemade sauerkraut will get mixed through this. That gives us our central, most important part of the dish and the core flavours. And like I say, I would find myself just eating this spread on the leftover bread, and it is delicious like this. So I decided to actually slightly reorder the menu and work this in as a small course that could be served alongside the homemade bread course in the middle of the savoury portion of the menu. So to suit that, I opted to mould the pâté into a simple but nice presentable shape by spreading it into these silicone moulds and then freezing them. Once you unmould these portions of the pâté, they hold their shape on the plate. So next, I quite quickly came to a decision about the flavours that I wanted to pair along with this. I really like the bright herby notes of tarragon with this, as well as the simple freshness of cucumber. And so I make a tarragon oil. And if you want to see a more detailed look about how I make my herb oils, I have a video where I go through that process in depth. But in brief, I quickly blanch tarragon and then chill it in ice water. And then the herb gets dried off before being blended with oil and filtered. To get the clearest possible oils, I will sometimes spin them in the centrifuge as well. And then for this little course, I cut small balls of fresh cucumber and I vacuum pack them with that tarragon oil. It's a really simple preparation, and then I can just place a few of these cucumber balls inside the moulded cashew pâté and drizzle over a little more of that tarragon oil. Then the last flavour element here for some contrast and punchiness is this really intense low temperature blood orange reduction. This is something that I make each winter when blood oranges come into season. This is really flavourful and a little bit goes a long way, so it's just really a couple of drops that you need. I just slice and juice my blood oranges and then take that filtered juice and then reduce that juice down and concentrate it at low temperature in the Rotovap. The Rotovap's more usually used as distilling equipment, and you can drop the pressure within it so that liquids boil at a lower temperature. So that allows you to make low temperature distillations, but also to make reductions like this at very low temperatures without heating your liquid up really much above room temperature at all. So you can keep all the bright freshness of an ingredient like this blood orange, but hyper concentrate it without changing its fundamental flavour and freshness. It's a pretty incredible technique, and the blood orange reduction is something that really makes the most of this. So the pâté gets finished with just a few drops of that intense reduction, and now I have my finished central element. The final things to think about were just the serviceware and the final presentation. Because I wanted to serve this alongside the bread course, I wanted the dishes this was in to have space so that guests could rest their bread on the side of it as well, and I didn't have anything quite right for that. So next up I went and spoke to Becky, the fantastic ceramicist who's made a lot of beautiful bespoke pieces for my menu. Becky is great, she's always up for trying interesting things and full of creative ideas. She made me these ceramic rings that I used to serve the distilled Scotch bonnet chocolate truffle in at the end of the tasting menu. So we talked about the dish, the ideas behind it, how it's going to fit into the whole menu, and Becky was able to make me a prototype to do a little bit of initial work with. Then here you can actually see her making the finished dishes that we decided on. So we opted for a wide rim style of dish, which gives you lots of negative space around the central element. That's both quite practical, and it also has this nice classical, sort of quite elegant feel to it, I think. And then with the glaze, we have a more textured, slightly rustic feel, which feels right to me for serving alongside something like the bread and butter. The wide rims work really well to frame the central element, but also crucially they give me this place for the guests to rest their pieces of bread whilst they're eating this. So I was absolutely thrilled with these. They're really beautiful, as is all of Becky's work. And that takes us up to this last little finishing element of these blackened carrot tuiles, which are just the final touch for the dish. So I make these using a vegetable crisp technique that I've featured on here before, but I will quickly show it to you now, as well as putting the recipe down in the description too. First off, I gently cook my carrots in the water bath, and then they get combined with corn flour, isomalt, glucose and salt, before this is blended well to a puree. Then I add a little edible activated charcoal to this mixture, which gives it its jet black colour. That puree gets spread into these silicone moulds, and then they go into a low dehydrator just to partially dry them until you can remove these little intricate shapes. The blackened carrot shapes get dipped into oil heated to 90 degrees, and then after that they go into a warm oven at 90 degrees as well, just to lightly bake. Finally, those shapes go into a dehydrator overnight as a final drying stage to make sure they're as crisp as possible. These are placed on top of the cashew nut pâté to finish the dish just at the last minute, once the warmed bread has gone out to the guests at their table. So I do have some dishes on the menu that have more intricate presentations, but something like this is great for this point in the menu where I'm taking out the bread nice and warm, and this just finishes quite quickly and easily. And it still looks really beautiful because of these fantastic bespoke plates that Becky made, and just these little finishing touches like the blackened carrot to augment a dish that's fundamentally quite simple and delicious. So I was really excited with how this ended up working, and I hope it's interesting to see not just how a dish is made, but some of the other parts of the process with putting something new onto the menu. Let me know in the comments if this sort of thing is interesting and you'd like to see more about some of the processes that kind of go on behind the scenes, or whether you prefer more straight up ingredient, technique, recipe videos and that kind of thing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.